The restaurant buzzed with the usual afternoon chatter. Waiters weaved through tables, balancing trays of steaming food and colorful drinks. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and spices, mingling with the soft clinking of cutlery against plates. It was a lively scene, filled with people from all walks of life. Businessmen in sharp suits, families laughing over shared meals, and young couples stealing glances at each other across candle-lit tables. In one corner of the room, away from the hustle and bustle, sat a woman named Clara. She wasn't dressed like most of the patrons. Her faded floral dress looked like it had seen better days, and her shoes were scuffed, as though they'd walked many miles. But there was something about her that stood out anyway. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, calm, composed, and almost regal despite her simple appearance. Or maybe it was the quiet smile on her face, as if she knew something no one else did. Clara's table was small but cozy, tucked slightly out of view near a potted plant. She sipped her tea slowly, gazing out the window at the busy street outside. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried past, and the world moved at its usual frantic pace. Yet Clara seemed completely at peace, untouched by the chaos around her. She didn't seem to notice or care about the whispers starting to ripple through the room. At a nearby table, a group of well-dressed individuals had settled in for lunch. There was Victor, a man in his mid-30s with slicked back hair and an expensive watch glinting on his wrist. He was flanked by three others. Sarah, who wore oversized sunglasses even indoors. Greg, whose booming laugh could be heard above everyone else's. And Lisa, who constantly checked her phone while pretending to listen to the conversation. They were the kind of people who turned heads when they entered a room, not because they were particularly remarkable, but because they made sure everyone noticed them. It didn't take long for their attention to drift toward Clara. At first it was just idle curiosity. Who was this woman sitting alone so quietly in such plain clothes? Was she lost, waiting for someone, or perhaps she had wandered in by mistake? These questions floated around their table until Greg broke the silence. "Look at her," he said, nodding discreetly in Clara's direction. "What do you think she's doing here?" Victor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Probably hoping someone will buy her lunch," Sarah giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. "Or maybe she thinks this is some charity event. You know, where rich people throw scraps to the less fortunate." Their laughter grew louder, drawing a few curious glances from neighboring tables. Clara didn't react. She continued sipping her tea, her expression unchanged. If anything, she looked even more serene, as though their words couldn't touch her. Encouraged by the lack of response, the group grew bolder. Lisa finally put down her phone and joined in. "I bet she doesn't even have enough money to pay for that cup of tea," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Do you think she'll try running out without paying?" Greg chuckled. "If she does, I'll personally chase her down. Can't let her ruin the reputation of this place, can we?" Victor raised his glass in mock celebration. "To keeping the riffraff out," he declared, earning another round of laughter from his friends. Despite their cruelty, Clara remained unfazed. She glanced at them once or twice, her eyes calm and steady, but she never said a word. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Flipping it open, she began jotting something down, her pen moving steadily across the page. Whatever she was writing, it seemed important to her, as if the mocking voices around her were nothing more than distant echoes. As the minutes ticked by, the group's taunts became more elaborate. They speculated about Clara's background, inventing wild stories about how she ended up in the restaurant. Some suggested she was homeless. Others guessed she was a struggling artist or a failed entrepreneur. Each theory was met with snickers and nods of agreement, fueling their sense of superiority. But what none of them realized was that Clara wasn't just any ordinary diner. She had come to the restaurant with a purpose, one that would soon reveal itself in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. For now, though, she simply sat there letting their words wash over her like rain on a window pane. And as the clock ticked closer to the next hour, the faintest trace of a knowing smile played on her lips. The group's laughter echoed through the restaurant, a sharp contrast to the quiet elegance of the space. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he gestured dramatically with his hands. "Honestly," he said, his voice dripping with smugness, "people like her shouldn't even be allowed in places like this. I mean, look at her, she doesn't belong here." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, twirling a strand of her perfectly styled hair. "Exactly. This is supposed to be a classy restaurant, not some charity kitchen." She wrinkled her nose, glancing over at Clara with thinly veiled disgust. "It's almost offensive, you know? Like she's trying to pretend she's one of us," Greg chimed in, his booming laugh cutting through the hum of conversation around them. "Pretend? Please, Sarah. She's not fooling anyone. Look at those clothes, they're practically falling apart. And those shoes? They've seen more miles than my car." He slapped the table for emphasis, causing a few nearby diners to glance over uncomfortably. Lisa, who had been scrolling through her phone, finally looked up and added her 2 cents. "I don't get it. Why would someone like her even come here? It's not like she can afford anything on the menu. Maybe she's just killing time until they kick her out." Their words hung in the air, cruel and cutting, but Clara didn't flinch. She remained seated in her corner, her posture relaxed and unhurried. If anything, she seemed almost amused, though her expression gave little away. The notebook she had been writing in earlier was now closed, resting gently on the table beside her teacup. Every so often, she would take a sip of her tea, savoring it as if it were the finest drink in the world. Victor, emboldened by the lack of reaction, decided to push things further. "You know what?" he said, raising his voice slightly so that others nearby could hear. "I'll bet she's waiting for someone to pay for her meal. Probably thinks we're all going to feel sorry for her and toss her a few coins." He mimicked tossing change onto the table, eliciting another round of giggles from his friends. Clara's eyes flickered toward them briefly, meeting Victor's gaze for the briefest moment. There was no anger or resentment in her expression, just a calm, steady look that made him pause mid-sentence. For a split second, he felt a strange unease, as if he'd underestimated her somehow. But then Greg interrupted his thoughts with another joke, and the feeling quickly passed. "Maybe she's waiting for her fairy godmother," Greg quipped, earning yet another burst of laughter. "You know, someone to swoop in and turn her pumpkin into a carriage, or at least give her a makeover." The group dissolved into fits of mirth, their voices growing louder and more obnoxious with each passing minute. By now, several other patrons had turned to look, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright annoyance. A waiter approached their table, clearing his throat politely. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Victor. "Could you please keep your voice down? You're disturbing the other guests." Victor waved him off dismissively. "Relax, we're just having a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" The waiter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually retreated without saying another word. Satisfied, Victor turned back to his friends, eager to continue their mockery. "Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, the pumpkin and the fairy godmother. Classic stuff." But as much as they tried to provoke her, Clara refused to rise to the bait. Instead, she reached into her bag again and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, she placed it on the table in front of her. It was a receipt, crisp and pristine, with the restaurant's logo printed at the top. She glanced at it briefly, then slid it back into her bag without a word. This small action caught Lisa's attention. "What's that?" she asked, squinting across the room. "Did she just pull out money?" Sarah snorted. "Please." Knowing her, it's probably a coupon or something. "Maybe she clipped it from the newspaper, or stole it," Greg suggested, grinning wickedly. Wouldn't put it past her. Their taunts continued, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some of the other diners had begun whispering among themselves, casting disapproving looks at Victor and his friends. Even the staff seemed to be keeping a closer eye on them, their movements brisk and deliberate as they served nearby tables. Meanwhile, Clara appeared completely unfazed. She adjusted her scarf, smoothing out an imaginary wrinkle, and glanced toward the entrance of the restaurant. Her lips curved upward ever so slightly, as if she were expecting something, or someone, to arrive. Whatever it was, She didn't seem worried. In fact, she radiated a quiet confidence as though she knew the tide was about to turn. Victor noticed her glance toward the door and followed her gaze curiously. "What's she looking at?" he muttered under his breath. "Think she's waiting for someone?" "Who cares?" Sarah replied, rolling her eyes. "Even if someone shows up, it's not like it'll change anything. She's still the same boring nobody sitting in the corner." Unbeknownst to them, however, the sound of screeching tires suddenly filled the air outside. Heads turned toward the window as a sleek black Porsche pulled up to the curb, its engine growling softly before coming to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, a sharply dressed figure exuding authority and charisma. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and his polished shoes gleamed in the sunlight. For a moment, everyone in the restaurant froze, unsure of what was happening. Then the man strode purposefully toward the entrance, his presence commanding immediate attention. As he disappeared inside, whispers erupted throughout the room. Who was this mysterious visitor? And why had he chosen to arrive at this particular moment? Victor and his friends exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado fading slightly. Something about the man's arrival felt significant, though none of them could quite put their finger on why. All eyes were on him as he scanned the room, searching for someone. When his gaze landed on Clara, a broad smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward her table, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. Whatever was about to happen next, it was clear that the balance of power in the room had shifted, and Victor and his friends were no longer in control. The sleek black Porsche parked outside the restaurant caught everyone's attention, including Clara's. She didn't turn her head dramatically or gasp in surprise. Instead, a faint smile played on her lips as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. The man who stepped out of the car was tall and impeccably dressed, his tailored suit fitting him like it had been stitched just for him. His polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he moved with purpose toward the entrance of the restaurant. Every step he took radiated confidence, authority, and an unmistakable air of importance. Inside, the room fell silent. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates, and even the waitstaff seemed momentarily frozen in place. All eyes were glued to the newcomer as he entered, his presence commanding immediate respect. He scanned the room quickly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the tables until it landed on Clara. For a brief second, their eyes met, and the corner of his mouth curled into a warm, genuine smile. Without hesitation, he strode across the restaurant, his movements smooth and deliberate. The clicking of his shoes against the tiled floor echoed through the now hushed space, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. People craned their necks to get a better look at him, whispering quietly among themselves. Who was this man? Why did he seem so familiar yet so out of place in this ordinary afternoon setting? Victor and his friends exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier mockery had faded into awkward silence as they watched the scene unfold. Something about the man's arrival felt significant, though none of them could quite put their finger on why. "Do you know him?" Lisa whispered nervously, leaning closer to Victor. Victor shook his head, his usual smug demeanor replaced by confusion and a hint of unease. "No idea," he muttered under his breath. "But whoever he is, he doesn't belong here." As the man approached Clara's table, the contrast between them couldn't have been starker. Clara, in her simple dress and worn-out shoes, sat calmly in her chair, her expression serene. The man, on the other hand, exuded wealth and power, every detail of his appearance screaming success. Yet there was no arrogance in his demeanor, only warmth and respect as he came to a stop beside her. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice rich and clear, carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. "I'm so sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible." Clara looked up at him and smiled gently as if his apology wasn't necessary. "It's quite all right, Richard," she replied, her tone soft but steady. "I've been enjoying my tea while waiting." The name Richard sent a ripple through the restaurant. Several patrons exchanged knowing looks, murmuring quietly to each other. Some recognized him immediately. Richard Langley, the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the country. His face had appeared in countless magazines and news articles, and his company was known for revolutionizing the industry. But what was someone like him doing here, speaking to someone like Clara? Richard pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, completely at ease despite the growing buzz around them. He gestured toward the waiter, ordering a coffee without, breaking stride in their conversation. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone casual but sincere. "It's been far too long since we last spoke." Clara nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. "I've been well, thank you. And yourself?" "Well enough," Richard replied with a small chuckle. "Though running a company keeps me busier than I'd like. Still, it's always worth it when I get to see the impact of the work we're doing." Their exchange was polite and unhurried, almost as if they were old friends catching up after years apart. To the onlookers, however, it was anything but ordinary. How did Clara know Richard Langley? What connection could possibly exist between a humble woman in a faded dress and one of the most powerful men in the business world? Victor and his friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. Greg leaned forward slightly, trying to eavesdrop on their conversation, while Sarah fidgeted with her napkin, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Lisa kept glancing at her phone, as if hoping to distract herself from the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, Richard turned his attention briefly to the staff, introducing himself with a friendly nod. "Thank you for accommodating us," he said, his voice warm and appreciative. "We'll only be a few minutes." Then, without missing a beat, he returned his focus to Clara, treating her with the same level of respect and admiration he might show to a close colleague or even a mentor. The whispers grew louder as the reality began to sink in. Clara wasn't just some random diner. She was someone important, someone Richard Langley clearly held in high regard. For Victor and his group, this revelation was both shocking and humiliating. They had mocked her mercilessly, assuming she was insignificant, only to discover that they couldn't have been more wrong. Richard must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere because he glanced briefly in their direction, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything directly to them, not yet, but the weight of his gaze lingered, making it clear that he knew exactly what had transpired before his arrival. For Clara, none of this seemed to matter. She sat quietly, listening to Richard, with the same composed grace she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Her earlier calmness now made perfect sense. It wasn't indifference or ignorance, it was confidence. Confidence not in herself, but in the knowledge that truth and integrity would always prevail, no matter how harsh the judgment or how loud the mockery. As the waiter brought Richard's coffee, the two resumed their conversation, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the stares and whispers surrounding them. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that their bond went beyond mere acquaintance. There was history here, trust and mutual respect. And as the rest of the restaurant slowly pieced together the puzzle, one thing became abundantly clear. Clara was far more than she appeared to be, and the lesson she and Richard were about to deliver would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. As Richard stirred his coffee, the faint clinking of the spoon against the porcelain cup seemed to echo louder than it should have in the now tense atmosphere of the restaurant. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression calm and composed. To anyone watching, their interaction appeared perfectly ordinary, two people sharing a quiet conversation over drinks. But the undercurrent of tension rippling through the room told a different story. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes scanning the restaurant as if taking stock of the situation. He didn't need to ask what had happened before. He arrived. The whispers, the stolen glances, and the palpable discomfort emanating from certain corners of the room spoke volumes. His gaze finally settled on Victor and his group, who were still sitting at their table, frozen like deer caught in headlights. Their earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and thinly veiled panic. Turning his attention back to Clara, Richard's voice softened. "You didn't say anything to them?" he asked gently, his tone betraying no judgment but rather a quiet understanding. Clara shook her head, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "No, there was no need," she replied simply. Words don't always change minds, Richard. Sometimes actions speak louder. Richard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. True enough, he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, but sometimes words can help drive the point home. With that, he turned slightly in his chair, addressing the entire restaurant. Not loudly, but with a clarity that commanded attention. Every head swiveled toward him, including those of the staff, who had been hovering discreetly nearby. Even the clatter of dishes in the kitchen seemed to fade into silence. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice warm yet firm. I hope you'll forgive me for intruding on your meals, but I feel compelled to share something about the remarkable woman sitting beside me. He gestured toward Clara, whose serene demeanor remained unchanged despite the sudden spotlight. Her name is Clara Bennett, and while she may not wear expensive clothes or drive luxury cars, she possesses something far more valuable: integrity, kindness, and an unwavering belief in the potential of others. A murmur rippled through the crowd, curiosity mingling with disbelief. People leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear more. Richard continued, his tone carrying the weight of authority, but also a deep sense of gratitude. Years ago, when I was just starting my company, I was struggling, more than most people realize. My savings were depleted. Investors had turned me away and I was ready to give up. That's when Clara stepped in. He paused, letting the significance of his words sink in. She invested in my dream, not because she expected anything in return, but because she believed in the power of innovation and the importance of supporting someone willing to take a chance. The room was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on Richard as he spoke. Victor and his friends exchanged panicked glances, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of this revelation. Sarah sank lower in her seat, her cheeks flushed with shame, while Greg stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Richard went on, his words deliberate and measured. Clara didn't ask for recognition or repayment. In fact, she insisted on remaining anonymous, asking only that I pay her generosity forward someday, and so I did. And today, because of her faith in me, thousands of people benefit from the work we do. He paused again, allowing the impact of his story to settle over the room. Then, turning slightly toward Victor and his group, he added, It's easy to judge someone based on appearances, isn't it? We look at what they wear, how they carry themselves, where they come from, and we make assumptions. But let me tell you something. True wealth has nothing to do with material possessions. It's about character, compassion, and the ability to see beyond surface-level differences. His gaze lingered on Victor, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smug businessman who had mocked Clara earlier now looked like a chastised child. His confidence shattered. For a moment he opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology, but no words came out. Clara reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on Richard's arm. That's enough, she said softly, her voice barely audible but filled with quiet strength. They'll learn in time. Richard nodded, respecting her wishes, and turned back to the rest of the room. Thank you for indulging me, he said with a small smile. And thank you, Clara, for reminding us all of what truly matters. The restaurant erupted into spontaneous applause, breaking the spell that had held everyone captive. Waiters and diners alike clapped enthusiastically, their admiration for Clara evident in their expressions. Some even stood up to get a better look at her, marveling at the humility and grace she exuded despite the ordeal she had endured. Victor and his friends, however, remained rooted in their seats, their faces pale and drawn. Lisa buried her face in her hands while Greg stared blankly at the table, his earlier bravado completely gone. Sarah fidgeted nervously, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As for Victor, he slumped in his chair, his expensive watch and tailored suit suddenly feeling hollow and meaningless. For Clara, none of this seemed to matter. She accepted the applause with a modest nod, her focus remaining on Richard as they resumed their conversation. Whatever lesson she had intended to teach, or perhaps hadn't intended at all, had been delivered, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. As the initial wave of applause subsided, the hum of conversation returned, albeit quieter and more subdued than before. People whispered among themselves, recounting what they had witnessed and marveling at the unexpected turn of events. Many glanced toward Clara and Richard, their respect and admiration evident in their expressions. Meanwhile, Victor and his group sat in stunned silence, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. They had entered the restaurant as self-proclaimed judges of character, convinced of their own superiority. Now, they were forced to confront the harsh truth, that their assumptions had been not only wrong but cruel, and as the reality of their behavior sank in, they realized that the road to redemption would be long and difficult, but necessary. Clara, for her part, showed no interest in vengeance or gloating. Her calm acceptance of the situation spoke volumes about her character, reinforcing the very qualities Richard had praised moments earlier. She wasn't seeking validation or revenge. She simply wanted to enjoy her tea and share a pleasant conversation with an old friend. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting golden light across the room, the restaurant buzzed with renewed energy. The mood had shifted dramatically, from one of casual indifference to one of reflection and appreciation. And at the center of it all sat Clara Bennett, a quiet reminder that greatness often comes in unassuming forms, waiting patiently to reveal itself when the time is right. As the applause in the restaurant began to fade, the atmosphere shifted once again. The initial shock and awe had settled into a quieter, more introspective mood. People returned to their meals, but the energy in the room was different now, softer, more reflective. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by occasional glances toward Clara and Richard, who continued their discussion as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. For Victor and his friends, however, the weight of what had happened lingered like a storm cloud over their table. They sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with each other and anyone else in the room. The mocking laughter that had filled the space earlier felt like a distant memory, replaced now by an uncomfortable silence. Each of them wrestled with their own emotions, shame, regret, and a gnawing sense of guilt, but none dared to speak first. Victor, who had been the ringleader of the cruel jokes, seemed particularly shaken. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a slouched posture and a furrowed brow. He stared at his plate, pushing food around with his fork without taking a bite. Every so often he would glance up, only to find someone nearby looking at him with disapproval or pity. It was unbearable. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Victor leaned forward slightly and whispered hoarsely to his companions, "We need to say something." Sarah looked at him incredulously. "What are we supposed to say? Oops, sorry for being jerks. Do you think that's going to fix anything?" "It's better than sitting here like statues," Greg muttered under his breath, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Maybe we should apologize." Lisa nodded hesitantly, her fingers nervously tapping against her phone screen. "Yeah, but how? Just walk over there and interrupt them? What if she doesn't accept it?" Their uncertainty hung heavy in the air, but deep down they all knew one thing. Doing nothing wasn't an option. The lesson Clara and Richard had delivered wasn't just meant for show. It was a call to action, a reminder that words and actions carry consequences. And while they couldn't undo what had already been said, they could at least try to make amends. Summoning whatever courage he had left, Victor stood up abruptly, causing his chair to scrape loudly against the floor. The sudden movement drew stares from several patrons, including Clara and Richard. For a moment, Victor froze, acutely aware of everyone watching him. Then, swallowing hard, he forced himself to take a step forward, and then another, until he reached Clara's table. Clara looked up at him calmly, her expression unreadable. Richard raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze assessing Victor's every move. The rest of the group remained seated, holding their collective breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Victor began, his voice trembling slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry, all of us are." He gestured vaguely toward his friends, who were still sitting at their table, looking both relieved and terrified. "We didn't know who you were, or what you'd done for people like Mr. Langley, and we judged you unfairly. That was wrong, and we regret it." The words tumbled out awkwardly, raw and unpolished, but sincere. Victor's face flushed, red as he finished, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. For a long moment no one spoke. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Clara's response. Clara studied him quietly, her eyes softening ever so slightly. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice gentle but firm. "Apologies aren't easy to give, and I appreciate your honesty." Victor blinked, caught off guard by her graciousness. He had expected anger, dismissal, maybe even mockery in return, but not kindness. It threw him off balance, forcing him to confront the stark contrast between his behavior and hers. How could someone who had been treated so poorly respond with such grace? "We'll leave you to your meal," Victor mumbled, backing away slowly. "Again, thank you." As he returned to his seat, the tension in the room eased slightly. His friends greeted him with tentative smiles, grateful that the ordeal was over, for now. But the ripple effects of Clara's quiet strength were far from finished. Over the days and weeks that followed, the story of Clara Bennett spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. Word of mouth carried tales of the humble woman who had inspired. One of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. Social media buzzed with posts from witnesses describing the encounter in vivid detail. Some shared photos of Clara and Richard, while others recounted the powerful lesson about judging others based on appearances. Victor found himself haunted by the experience. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a fluke, a random event that didn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But the image of Clara's calm smile stayed with him, lingering in his mind like an unanswered question. Who was this woman, really? How could she remain so composed in the face of such cruelty? And why did her forgiveness feel heavier than the judgment he had dished out? Determined to understand, Victor decided to dig deeper. He started researching Clara online, hoping to uncover more about her life and background. What he discovered astonished him. Clara wasn't just an investor in Richard's company. She had quietly supported dozens of startups and community projects over the years, always insisting on anonymity. Her generosity extended far beyond financial contributions. She volunteered at local shelters, mentored struggling entrepreneurs, and championed causes that helped uplift marginalized communities. The more Victor learned, the more ashamed he felt of his earlier behavior. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, asking for nothing in return, and he had mocked her without a second thought. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, forcing him to reevaluate not only his actions that day, but also the way he viewed people in general. Inspired by Clara's example, Victor began making changes in his own life. He started volunteering at a nearby homeless shelter, something he had never considered before. At work, he made a conscious effort to listen more and judge less, treating colleagues and clients with greater respect and empathy. Even his relationship with his friends improved as they too began reflecting on their behavior and striving to be better versions of themselves. One evening, months after the incident, Victor decided to visit the same restaurant where everything had unfolded. He walked in cautiously, half expecting to be recognized and shamed. Instead, he was greeted warmly by the staff, who remembered him fondly despite the circumstances of his last visit. Taking a deep breath, he approached the hostess and asked if Clara was dining there today. The hostess shook her head apologetically. "I'm afraid not," she said. "Ms. Bennett doesn't come here often anymore. But when she does, she always leaves a lasting impression." Victor nodded, unsurprised yet still disappointed. He hadn't expected Clara to stick around after delivering such a profound lesson. Part of him wished he could thank her properly, express his gratitude for the change she had sparked within him, but deep down he realized that wasn't necessary. Clara's impact wasn't about recognition, it was about transformation. As Victor sat alone at a corner table, sipping a cup of tea much like Clara had done that fateful afternoon, He allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time he felt hopeful. Hopeful that he could continue growing, learning, and becoming someone worthy of the second chance he had been given. And somewhere, perhaps miles away or just around the corner, Clara went about her quiet life, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the lives she had touched. She didn't seek fame or fortune, nor did she crave validation. Her reward was in the ripple effect of her actions, spreading outward like waves on a still pond, touching hearts and minds in ways she might never fully know. But for those who had crossed her path even briefly, her presence lingered, a gentle reminder that greatness often comes in unexpected forms. And sometimes all it takes is a single act of kindness to change the world. The weeks and months that followed Clara's encounter at the restaurant became a turning point for many who had witnessed it, or even heard about it later. Stories of her quiet strength and humility spread like wildfire, inspiring people to reflect on their own lives and actions. For Victor and his friends, the change was particularly profound. What had started as a moment of public humiliation evolved into a journey of self-discovery and growth, a transformation they hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. Victor, once so confident in his judgments, found himself questioning everything. He thought he knew about success, wealth, and human worth. The image of Clara sitting calmly amidst their cruel taunts stayed with him, a constant reminder of how wrong he had been. He began reading books on empathy, attending seminars on leadership, and seeking ways to make amends not just for what he'd done to Clara, but for all the times he'd dismissed or belittled others without thinking twice. His newfound perspective didn't go unnoticed by those around him. At work, colleagues remarked on how much more approachable and supportive he had become. Instead of barking orders or dismissing ideas outright, Victor now listened intently, encouraging input from everyone on his team. One coworker, Sarah, not the same Sarah from the restaurant, approached him after a meeting and said, "You've changed, Victor. I don't know what happened, but thank you." Victor smiled faintly, remembering Clara's words. Sometimes actions speak louder. He realized then that redemption wasn't about grand gestures, it was about small, consistent efforts to be better. And though he still carried the weight of his past mistakes, he felt lighter knowing he was moving in the right direction. As for Greg, Lisa, and Sarah, the others in Victor's group, they too underwent transformations, each in their own way. Greg, whose booming laugh had once filled the room with arrogance, became quieter and more introspective. He started volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring teenagers interested in entrepreneurship. Sharing his knowledge and experience gave him a sense of purpose he'd never felt before, and the kids adored him for his enthusiasm and encouragement. Lisa, ever glued to her phone, discovered a passion for storytelling. Inspired by Clara's unassuming yet impactful presence, she began documenting acts of kindness she encountered in everyday life. Her blog gained traction quickly, resonating with readers who craved positivity in a world often dominated by negativity. Through her writing, Lisa learned to see beauty and simplicity and value in moments that might otherwise go unnoticed. Sarah, perhaps the most image-conscious of the group, surprised everyone, including herself, by pursuing volunteer work at a women's shelter. She helped organize clothing drives, taught makeup workshops to boost confidence, and even offered free styling sessions for job interviews. It was a side of her no one had seen before, least of all herself. When asked why she chose this path, she simply replied, "Because someone reminded me we're all more than what we wear." Their individual journeys were proof that change, though difficult, was possible. Each of them carried the memory of Clara's calm dignity as a guiding light, using it to navigate the challenges of becoming better versions of themselves. They weren't perfect. They stumbled, doubted, and backtracked occasionally, but they kept trying. And that effort, more than anything, was what mattered. Meanwhile, Clara continued living her life much as she always had, quietly, humbly, and with unwavering grace. She didn't seek recognition for her good deeds, nor did she expect gratitude from those she helped. To her, kindness was its own reward, a ripple effect that touched lives in ways she might never fully understand. Occasionally, she would receive letters or messages from people thanking her for her support, whether financial, emotional, or otherwise. She read them with a soft smile, tucking them away in a drawer alongside other mementos of her journey. One day, while walking through a park near her home, Clara noticed a familiar face sitting on a bench. It was Victor, looking older and wiser than the last time she'd seen him. His suit was simpler, his posture less rigid, and his expression softer. He spotted her almost immediately and stood up, hesitating for a moment before approaching her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again, but I wanted to thank you." Clara tilted her head slightly, her eyes warm and inviting. "For what?" she asked gently, as if genuinely curious. "For teaching me something I'll never forget," Victor replied. "About humility. About seeing people for who they truly are. Not just what they seem. You didn't have to say anything that day, but your silence spoke volumes." Clara chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It wasn't my silence that taught you, Victor. It was your willingness to listen, to yourself and to others. That's where real growth begins." Victor nodded, absorbing her words. After a pause, he added, "I hope you know that what you've done, for me, for Richard, for everyone you've helped, it hasn't gone unnoticed. Even if you prefer to stay out of the spotlight, your impact is everywhere." Clara smiled, her gaze drifting toward the children playing nearby. "Kindness has a way of spreading, doesn't it? Like seeds carried by the wind. You plant one, and soon there's a garden." With that, she bid Victor farewell, continuing her walk through the park. As she disappeared into the crowd, he stood there for a moment watching her go. Though their interaction had been brief, it left an indelible mark on him, a final reminder that greatness isn't measured by titles or possessions, but by the lives we touch and the legacies we leave behind. Years later, when Victor reflected, on that day in the restaurant he realized it had been a gift disguised as a lesson. Clara hadn't sought to shame or embarrass anyone. She had simply allowed events to unfold naturally, trusting that truth and integrity would prevail. Her quiet confidence had planted seeds of change not just in him, but in countless others who had crossed her path. In the end, Clara's story wasn't about wealth, power, or fame. It was about the enduring power of humility, compassion, and grace. It was about choosing to see the best in people even when they failed to see it in themselves. And it was about understanding that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give, and how we inspire others to do the same. As the years passed, Clara remained a quiet force for good in the world, her influence rippling outward, in ways both seen and unseen. For those fortunate enough to meet her or even hear her story, she served as a timeless reminder that greatness often comes wrapped in simplicity, and sometimes all it takes is a single act of kindness to spark a chain reaction that changes everything.